Alright guys, in this lesson our goal is to be able to solve and graph compound inequalities. So we're going to pull off of what we learned last lesson where we solved and graphed just regular inequalities. So by the end of this lesson you're going to be able to take these two problems and solve and graph them. That is what mastery is going to look like for this lesson. Okay, before we can get into solving compound inequalities, we need to talk about what they mean. So compound means I'm putting two things together. So compound inequality is simply two inequalities. And they're going to be joined together by the word either and or. So and means this and this must be true. So in order for something to be a solution, both parts must be true. Or just means one must be true. So this or this versus meaning of and this must be true. So here are examples of the way we would write it. So and is always going to have an x in the middle. It's going to have the lower boundary on the left and the upper boundary on the right. And we're going to have less than symbols. So what this says is that 2 and 10 are the outside parts and x is somewhere between 2 and 10. Versus or is going to have x is less than my smaller number, so it's going off to the right, or x is greater than my larger number. So that's how we'll write them, and this is how we say it. So this right here is said 2 is less than x is less than 10. This one, x is less than 2 or x is greater than 10. Alright, so of our objective, solving and graphing compound inequalities, we now have talked about what is a compound inequality. So it's two inequalities that are being put together, and they're either going to have the word and or in them. Alright, so I gave you some new learning. So what I want you to do is either off to the side in your notes or on a separate sheet of notebook paper, you need to have an interaction. So I want you to think about the new learning, what I just brought to you. What makes sense to you? What questions do you have? What picture would help you remember it? What analogy can you make? Any of those things, but you need to have an interaction in your notes or on a piece of notebook paper about that new learning. So maybe your question might be, what is this going to look like when I solve it? Or if you don't understand, why are the signs less than or something? What makes sense to you, maybe you might write and means both or means one. That could be something that makes sense to you, but you need to have an interaction in your notes. So let's look at the graphing piece. So when I look at this first example, I see that the solutions are to the left of -2, and I see that they don't include -2 because it's open. But I also see that there's solutions that are to the right of 5, but also include 5. So my solutions are over here or they're over here. So I hope you picked up on that important word. I said the solutions are over here or they're over here. So solutions have to make one of them true, but there's no number that could be less than -2 and greater than 5. So that can't be an and situation. This is an or. So we're going to write the compound inequality for this given scenario. So I always like to put my x above where the solution is because that's what it's representing. When I graph that, it's representing here are all the solutions. So I see that we're talking about x's that are less than -2. And I did not put or equal to because that is an open circle. And we said because it's going in two directions, this is an or. So x is less than -2 or x is greater than or equal to 5. And I can see that the x's are greater than 5, but they're also equal to, so I fill it in. So that's how we write a compound inequality in that inequality form. So we're going to practice that interval form that we talked about because this is going to make our lives easier later on if we become comfortable with it. So if I go to the left, that's -infinity. If I go to the right, that's +infinity. So if you notice, I have two inequalities that I wrote here. So this one is going to be from -infinity to -2, and it's going to be a parenthesis because it's not included. And then this one is going to be from 5 to +infinity, and it's a parenthesis, but I need to make this a bracket because the 5 is included. And then this is just a symbol that we're going to talk about later, but we do a U for union, meaning that these two are both, we're bringing those solutions together. All right, so that is the inequality in both interval and inequality form. So let's look at number 2. So I'm going to go ahead and put an X above where my solution set is, and I only put one X. So that means in my solution set, I'm only going to have one X. And if you notice, the X is between 0 and 7. So when there's just one set of shading, or one X, that's an and situation, meaning it has to make both true. So X has to be bigger than 0, but it has to be less than 7. And if I notice, they're both shaded in, so it's going to be or equal to. So I always put my smaller number on the left, my bigger number on the right, and it's going to be my signs like that. So 0 is less than or equal to X is less than or equal to 7. So when I look at those as two pieces, I could say 0 is less than or equal to X. Or if you notice, the sign is opening towards the X. So I could say X is greater than or equal to 0. And then my other piece, and X is less than or equal to 7. So it has to make both of those pieces true. So that's why we put it together. So in interval form, this one's a little easier because I only have one X. I only need to write one interval. And so basically, it goes from 0 to 7. I can see that graph goes from 0 to 7. It includes 0 and it includes 7. So that's the interval form. All right, I'd like you to pause the video and I'd like you to try number 3 and number 4 on your own. All right, so for number 3, hopefully you're able to see this was an or situation. So you can write that X is less than -8, and it does not include it, so it's going to the left. Or my solutions are over here where X is greater than 1. So X is greater than 1. And so because I have two X's and I have two intervals where that graph is true, I had to write two separate intervals. So it goes from -infinity, because it's going to the left, to 8, and it's not included. But then the graph skips and it goes from 1 to infinity, so there's that. And then for number 4, I see it's an and situation. I only have one place that I would put my X. My solutions are between -1 and 0.5. -1 is part of the solution, so it's or equal to. 0.5 is not. So in an interval form, it would look like this. -1 with the bracket, 2.5, 2 being all the way up to 0.5, and it's a parenthesis, not a bracket, because it is not included. All right, so now I'm given the inequality, and I'm going to try to graph it. So when I look at this, I see that I have X is greater than or equal to 4, or, so I'm going to have two areas that I'm shading, X is less than 2. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to put those on the number line. So 2 is going to come first, and then 4. Doesn't matter where you put them. You don't have to fill in all the numbers. So I can see the X, so my solutions where I'm going to shade are greater than or equal to 4. So that's going to be a closed circle at 4, and I'm shading everything greater than, so that is over here. All right, so X is less than 2, so it cannot be 2, so I'm going to put an open circle, and it's everything less than 2. So that is my solution set if I were to graph that compound inequality. All right, so when I look at number 2, I see that there is one X, so this is an and situation, and it's going to go between -5 and 7. So -5 is here, 7 is here, and it is not including -5, nor is it including 7, and the X's are between. So all of my solutions are in between. That represents my solution set. So go ahead and pause the video, and I'd like you to try 3 and 4 on your own. Alright, so hopefully you were able to see that this is an and situation, so it's going to be shading in between. This is an or situation, so I'm going to have the arrows going opposite directions. My smaller number comes first, my larger number, and they are both included in the solution set, so they are shaded in. Whereas up here, 0 is a solution, so it's a dot, but 9 is not, so it's an open, meaning it's up to this point, but it doesn't include. Alright, so we have now done these 3 things. Before we understood what a compound inequality was. Now we graphed it and stated the solutions. So we were able to write from a graph what all the solutions were. All right, so we've just moved on to the second part of our objective is to be able to graph and write from a graph. So I'd like you to look at what you've just learned. So where I was given the graph and I wrote the inequalities in both interval and inequality notation, and where I was given the inequality notation and I had to graph it. So what makes sense to you? What are you going to need to remember in the future? What are things that we looked for? What steps were there? What questions do you have? What analogy? Anything that would make sense, I need you to interact with your notes right now. All right, so these are the guiding questions that I use. So if you get stuck or you need help thinking through this process, go ahead and pull these out. So the first question is always, are there two inequality signs? So in order for it to be a compound inequality, I have to have two inequality signs because compound means I'm putting two things together. What are my two inequalities? So I need to identify the two inequalities. Then I need to solve for x. So I'm going to solve for both x's in those two inequalities. And then how do I state my final answer? So sometimes I have to put it all together. And then what do my solutions look like on a graph? All right, so I am going to model this first example over here where I have -5 is less than or equal to -10k plus 5, which is less than or equal to 45. So my first question is, are there two inequality signs? And I see that I have a sign here and a sign here. So yes, so I know this is a compound inequality. So then what are my two inequalities? So what I see is they both share this part right here. So I see that it's going to be, my first inequality is going to be -5 is less than or equal to -10k plus 5. So this is the first part of my inequality because I go all the way to that second inequality sign. So that tells me my first part of the inequality. So going back to what they share, I'm going to identify the second part of my inequality. So I'm going to go from this inequality sign all the way over. So the part that they share is also part of -10k plus 5 is going to also have to be less than or equal to 45. So this is an AND situation, so I'm going to go ahead and write AND. So what has to be true is that -5 has to be less than this value, and this value has to be less than or equal to 45. So now I have my two inequalities. And how do I solve for x? Well, now we just go back to what we already know, and I'm simply going to get x by itself, or k. So I see that my k's are already over on this side, so I'm going to get rid of that -5, or that +5 by subtracting. So -10 is less than or equal to -10k. And then I'm going to undo by dividing by -10. And something huge just jumped out at me is I divided by -10. So I'm still going to have k, but I got to flip my sign. And -10 divided by -10 is just 1. So then over on this side, I'm going to solve for my variable. So I'm also going to subtract 5. So -10k is less than or equal to 40. And then I'm going to undo by dividing by -10. Divide by -10. And since I divided by -10, I've got to flip my sign. Greater than or equal to -4. So then how do I state my final answer? So this is where it can get a little tricky if you don't really pay attention to what it's saying. So this is saying that k is greater than or equal to -4. So -4 is a small number. And this is saying 1 is greater than or equal to k. So essentially k is going to be smaller than this 1. So I always like to think about how can I put it together in a way that makes sense. So when I look at 1 and I look at -4, because I know this is an AND situation, so the k is going to be in the middle. I need to put the smallest number on the left and the largest number on the right. So I'm going to say -4, then I'm going to have k, and then I'm going to have 1. So when I look at the sign that's happening between -4 and k, it's opening towards the k. So I'm going to do it that way. And when I look at the sign here, it's opening away from the k. And so I'm going to write it like that. So I've just taken those two inequalities and I've put them together with that k in the middle because it's an AND situation. And just a side note, when we write it with our small number and our large number, the sign should always be less than and then less than because k is going to be sandwiched between. So it has to be bigger than this number. This number has to be smaller than k, but then k has to be smaller than that larger side. And then what does my solution set look like on a graph? All right, so I'm going to put my number line. I've got -4. I've got 1. And so I know 1 is a solution, -4 is a solution, and my k's are going to be somewhere in between. And sometimes it's easier if you are struggling with putting that together. Sometimes it's easier to put these on a graph and then write your inequality from the graph. All right, I'd like you to pause the video, and what I'd like you to do is answer the first 2 questions. So I'd like you to identify if you have 2 inequality signs and write the 2 inequalities like I did. All right, so hopefully you were able to see that the 2 inequalities are 29 is less than 8v minus 7, and the 8v minus 7 is less than or equal to 36. So this is the piece that they both share, so it needs to be part of both of those inequalities. All right, so then my next question is, how do I solve for x, or how do I solve for the variable? So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can solve for the 2 variables. All right, so hopefully you were able to come up with that that -3 is greater than v, and that v is greater than or equal to -4. So hopefully you were able to solve that down. So then how do I write my final answer? So again, this is an and situation, so I know I'm going to have a v in the middle. I need my smaller number on the left. So when I think about -3 and -4, -4 is going to go on the left, and -3 is just a little bit bigger. And so then how do my signs fit? Well, when I look at the -4 solution, the sign is opening towards the v, and when I look at the -3 solution, the sign is opening away from the v, towards the -3, meaning v is going to be less than -3, but v is greater than or equal to -4. So that's my solution in inequality notation. And then the last one is, how do I put it on a graph? So I've got -4, -3, open circle, closed circle, and I'm shading in between. All right, so when we do the or versions, these ones are super easy because they're already divided into the 2 inequalities. So my first question is, are there 2 inequality signs? Yes, there are. I've got the less than and I've got the greater than. So then what 2 inequalities can I write? Well, what's awesome is I already have one inequality here and one inequality here. So now I just solve. So I'd like you to pause the video and solve this one out. All right, so when you solved it out, hopefully you were able to get that x is greater than 7, or x is less than or equal to -6. So when I put that on a graph, -6 is a solution, but it's everything less than. 7 is not a solution, but it is the boundary of where the solutions start, and it's everything greater than that. So the ors are nice and easy. They are already divided up into 2 inequalities. So go ahead and pause the video and try the next example on your own. All right, so hopefully you arrived at m is less than or equal to -2, or m is greater than 3. And so when I put that on the number line, these are what my solutions are. So if I were asked, is 0 a solution to this inequality? So I have to think about, where is 0? So 0 would be right here between -2 and 3, and it is not in the shaded region. So if I were to plug 0 into either of those equations, if it's an or, it just has to make one of them true, but it doesn't make either of them true, so it is not a solution. Only numbers over here or over here will make one of those true. All right, this is your final check. I'd like you to go through and solve the next 2 problems on your own and see how you do. All right, so your solution is that 4 is less than x is less than 8, and this is what it looks like on a graph. And what that means is that the solutions, and means it has to make both true. So it has to be a solution to this and a solution to this. So that should actually say and. And so only numbers that fall between the 2 numbers will make it true. So 5, if I plug 5 into here and here, it will make both true. And for this one, hopefully you were able to see that n is less than -7, or it is greater than 4. So there are my solution sets. With an or, remember, it just has to make one of the inequalities true. And the last thing we're going to do is just when would I ever use this? What does this mean? Why would I need to know this? So there's two scenarios here. I would like you to write a compound inequality and graph all the solutions to the scenario. So pause the video and try that. All right, so a B is going to be any grade in between an 84.5 or equal to and a 92.4 or equal to. So a B is just one grade range. There's not this or this. It's got to be between this and this. So that's what that looks like. And then to get a note sent home, you either get a 93 or better, so yay, you got an A, or hey, you got less than a 75. So it is not included if it's a 75. You will not get a note sent home if it's a 75, but you will if it's a 93. All right, we have successfully done all of the sub-objectives that allow us to be able to solve and graph a compound inequality. All right, so that was a lot of information. You need to have an interaction right now. So what makes sense to you? Are there any questions that you have? What are you going to bring to your group when you're talking about this during your CSG the next time we have class? What pictures would help you? What be sure to statements do you need to write yourself? This is a chance to interact with what you've learned so far and kind of really process through it.